So tonight, the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum Summer Lecture Series is honored to present, Does the Just War Doctrine Imply Nuclear
Go for it.
Pacifism? Yeah. I've been practicing all week and I still can't get it right. Recent pronouncements by the Catholic Church leaders reflect a potentially significant shift in moral teaching regarding nuclear weapons and deterrence. Outright condemnation of the possession of nuclear weapons, along with related work being conducted in the national nuclear security enterprise, suggests a dangerous pacifist trend in official teaching. This talk will discuss the full set of principles that undergird the just war doctrine of the past, currently, and what it may look like in the future. We are blessed this evening to have Dr. Raymond Juzaitis as our guest speaker. He is a nuclear engineer with more than 40 years of experience. He has worked in a number of areas, including nuclear weapons management, nuclear nonproliferation, intelligence, counterterrorism, homeland security, and related R&D programs of the Department of Energy National Laboratories. His early focus in computational physics paved the way for a broad-based technical career that included nuclear weapons design, development, testing, and evaluation. During his career, he worked on a number of U.S. government programs of the Pentagon as well as the defense programs of the DOE. In the 90s, he was the leader of X Division at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is the weapons design division. There he was responsible for the transition from a testing-based culture to a more simulation-based culture to a science-based stockpile stewardship culture. Ray served as a senior member of both of the U.S. nuclear weapons physics laboratories, having also served at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory as the Associate Director for Nonproliferation, Homeland, and International Security. Following his retirement from the University of California, he served as a professor and department head of the Nuclear Engineering Department at Texas A&M. After that, he was the president and CEO of National Security Technology in Las Vegas, Nevada, which was the M&O contractor for the Nevada National Nuclear Security Site, which used to be known as the Nevada Test Site. Since then, he has continued his research in areas involving technology and policy for nonproliferation, nuclear weapons, and related national security interests. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ray Juzaitis.
Can you hear me now?
Only if you talk right into it, Ray.
I know.
Might want to just pull it out.
Okay. Susan, thank you for the introduction, kind introduction, and I'd like to thank the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum for inviting me to join in their series of presentations this summer. Let's see, I'll start. So as we feverishly await, the first screenings of this Oppenheimer movie, I think it's a very good and appropriate preview, not a preview, but a prelude for my talk to bring up the image of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant scientist, polymath, great scientific leader, who at the moment of his greatest technical triumph also had the vision to see how problematic, from a moral perspective, the future of the legacy he left behind could become. He was morally conflicted for the rest of his life, as I think this movie will very clearly illustrate, and it made him vulnerable. His moral conflict basically made him vulnerable to the McCarthy-era demagogues in the 1950s, to include Edward Teller. So with that as a prelim, let me first state a few disclaimers. I am a devout Roman Catholic, still not excommunicated from the church, and who has some concerns about recent church teachings, particularly as they are veering towards nuclear pacifism. And my purpose here is not necessarily to wash dirty linens in public, but to promote engagement between the nuclear professional laity and the church's magisterium. To those not familiar with Vatican talk, magisterium is the teaching authority of the Catholic Church. However, I would say that nuclear weapons deserve special moral consideration in all faith traditions, and the things that I will mention today I think shouldn't be foreign to many of you. The opinions expressed in this talk are my own, and not any laboratory, not any government agency, and probably not the church, maybe. So let me start out talking about church teaching in this vein. Salvation history, as you look at the Bible, presents God many times as a warrior. You know, from Exodus, the Lord is my strength and my song, he's become my salvation. The Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea. In the greatness of your majesty you overthrow your adversaries. You send forth your fury, it consumes them like stubble. And besides, war is referenced many times in the Bible. In Ecclesiastes, we read that for everything there is a season, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time for war and a time for peace. In the Psalms, who is the King of glory? The Lord, mighty in battle. Again in the Psalms, let the high praises of God be in their throats and two-edged swords in their hands, to wreak vengeance on the nations and chastisement on the peoples, to bind their kings with chains and their nobles with fetters of iron. Now, I'll take, besides the teachings and verses in the Bible about war, I'd like to deconstruct the moral framework into two basic moral imperatives that undergird just war doctrine. First of all, the Bible and the Catholic Church tradition condemn the taking of innocent life. Clearly, in Exodus, you shall not kill is one of the 10 Commandments. Later, Christ in the New Testament also proscribes the killing of others, but he actually kicks it up a notch by saying not only should you not kill your neighbor, you need to love your enemy. In the Catholic Church, human life is sacred. From the beginning, it involves the creative action of God, and God alone is the Lord of life. In the account of Abel's murder of Cain, or by Cain, you know, the scripture reveals, you know, the true presence of anger and envy in the heart of man, which are consequences of original sin. And basically, original sin follows man in his further development and evolution, and on issues of war and peace, one cannot observe that original sin is still in the heart of man. The second imperative in church teaching is that of self-defense. Whereas Christ said, he said, love your neighbor as yourself. He didn't say love your neighbor more than yourself. Therefore, self-defense is also heavily enunciated in church tradition. In fact, in the CCC is actually, for those of you who are not familiar, is a catechism of the Catholic Church. In these paragraphs, legitimate defense is regarded as a grave duty for someone responsible for another's life. It's not just a right, but a duty to protect the innocent from harm. And on the issue of self-defense, I'll bring up Maccabees. I know Maccabees isn't in a lot of Bibles, but it's in the Catholic Bible. It's one of the last books of the Old Testament in the Catholic Bible. And around 160 or 150 BC, Judea had been overrun and controlled by the successor state of Alexander the Great's empire, and the oppressors were trying to instill in the Jews Greek traditions, Hellenistic traditions, and also getting them to worship false gods. So Mattathias, a group of Jews, the Maccabean family led by 4 brothers, they started a rebellion, and in the course of this rebellion against the oppressors, one group of the Jews decided that since it was the Sabbath, they would not fight back, and so their little group was totally exterminated. And when their friends saw what had happened, that precipitates this verse: "If we all do as our brethren have done, and refuse to fight with the Gentiles for our lives and our ordinances, they will quickly destroy us from the earth. So they made this decision that day: let us fight against every man who comes to attack us on the Sabbath. Let us not all die as our brethren died in their hiding places." So let's talk about just war doctrine. What just war doctrine does, and just war doctrine actually took many hundreds of years to crystallize. St. Augustine first mentioned what it would take to have a just war back in the 4th century in the wake of the Roman Empire. But the one who is credited with really codifying just war principles was Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Ironically, around the same time that the Crusades were going on. But the use, so just war doctrine is divided into 2 sets of principles. One, jus ad bellum, which in Latin means rules before war, are considerations that a nation would take before they decided, or the leaders of the nation would take, before they decided to wage war. And there are four major ones. The war has to have a just cause, and just as a note, after 1957, Pope Pius XII, only one cause was really admissible in this category, and that was self-defense. Second, the war had to be declared and controlled by the proper authority. It had to be the last resort after all efforts to maintain peace were expended. And once it starts, it has to be conducted with the right intention from the very beginning, which would be to promote good and avoid evil, observe moral limits when a defensive war was necessary, and restore peace and justice as soon as possible. The second set of principles involve the conduct of war. And these, mainly 2 principles, are really where nuclear weapons, there would be cause for concern because of their immense capability and destructive power. One, war must be fought in a discriminate manner. collateral damage, especially to non-combatants in the civilian population, would have to be avoided, and military targets would be the only ones that are deemed legitimate. Also, the means employed in fighting the war would have to be proportionate to the ends that would be achieved. Therefore, the scope of conflict would have to be limited so the evil effects that are involved in the war, including the death and destruction, do not overwhelm the ultimate good that is attained in the outcome of the war. Now, what's really important here in the Catholic Church is catechism. The evaluation, who decides whether a war is just or not? I mean, there is, you could say, well, is it the church magisterium? No, it's not. And it's clearly stated in the catechism that the evaluation of these conditions for moral legitimacy belongs to the prudential judgment of those who have responsibility for the common good. And today you would regard that as the government, the military, and I guess if we're talking about nuclear weapons, the broad nuclear weapons complex. But mostly the government. Now, why do we see a shift in teaching from this doctrine in church teaching? Number one, the Vatican, and this is sort of a background, the Vatican is changing the traditional church teaching with regard to nuclear weapons and deterrence, and particularly has expressed this after the UN General Assembly in 2017 constructed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This treaty commits the signatories not to develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess, or stockpile nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. So it's fairly all-encompassing. The Holy See, which is the Vatican in terms of international circles, the Vatican is a legitimate state, a full state member of the international community. And it signed and ratified the treaty, one of the first members, in September of 2017. The treaty entered into force in January of 2021, but the treaty is terribly deficient in the sense that there are absolutely no monitoring or verification requirements or enforcement provisions. There's no way that a treaty like this could actually be actionable because you can't monitor, you can't verify, and ultimately there is no international authority that would enforce the provisions. Needless to say, no nuclear weapon states participated in the UN conference for obvious reasons. Now, in the wake of that conference, the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, which is a bureau, one of the bureaus of the Roman Curia, one of the agencies in their administrative arm, it called an international symposium on perspectives for a world free of nuclear weapons and for integral disarmament. They called this in November of 2017. It was organized by Cardinal Turkson of Ghana, and it was attended by a lot of fairly heavy-hitting leaders of the world, including international civic and church leaders. But it did provide Pope Francis the venue for delivering his public condemnation of nuclear deterrence. And this is a quote from his address to that conference, and I'll just highlight. He mentioned that he stated that if we also take into account the risk of an accidental detonation as a result of error of any kind, the threat of their nuclear weapons use, as well as their very possession, is to be firmly condemned. For they exist in the service of mentality of fear that affects not only the parties in conflict, but the entire human race. So the question comes up, how foundational a moral teaching is this? I mean, we know it's not an ex cathedra teaching that the Pope pronounces, but is it foundational in the sense that somehow it will spread throughout the church and be taken up by the full teaching authority of the church? Is it foundational, or is it just a political statement premised on the going anti-nuclear zeitgeist? It's a good question, because although coming from a deep empathic consideration of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war, which the Pope did when he went to Hiroshima, plus 75 years, which was in 2020. Unfortunately, it misrepresents, this teaching and the further documents that came with it, misrepresented the essential nature of what nuclear deterrence is in the contemporary global security environment today. Not what it was in the 50s, but what it is today. They reject the notion that deterrence has protected world peace, which is highly arguable, and I'll come to that a little later. It embraces the abolition of nuclear weapons as the essential foundation of collective security for the world. Interestingly, it talks, and this goes to Pope Francis's geopolitical perspective, which was formed in Argentina. Unlike John Paul II, who I will talk about in a minute or two, Pope Francis very much identifies with what we would call the third world nations today. And in fact, in their writings, nuclear weapon states are looked at as the oppressors in the world because they impose their will, and the third world nations are the oppressed because they are denied certain nuclear assets. At the same time, the slow progress of the nuclear weapon states toward disarmament is also noted and bemoaned. And then there is also this notion that disarmament, if only we could disarm, the funds could be reallocated to promote integral human development. Again, an arguable proposition. The cascading influence of the Pope's pronouncements led to a troubling pastoral letter in the Santa Fe Archdiocese. In January of 2022, Archbishop Wester issued a pastoral letter called Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a Conversation Toward Nuclear Disarmament. In this letter, he expressed his desire to engage in a spiritual conversation, especially in New Mexico, that would lead to nuclear disarmament. A tough road to hoe. He urges us to practice universal, nonviolent love with no justification for warfare, and basically, there is no such thing as a just war. Again, nuclear deterrence is terribly mischaracterized, and he disparages U.S. nuclear weapons policy directly. He actually condemns Los Alamos and Sandia nuclear weapons work and promotes pacification of the laboratories. Also, Los Alamos is viewed as a net economic drain on New Mexico, and goes on to cite demographic statistics as evidence of economic inequality and institutionalized racism endemic to our country. Unfortunately, if you peruse all of his references, and he does reference, his letter, there is absolutely no evidence of prior discussion with Catholics who are involved in nuclear weapons work. He surrounded himself with the anti-nuclear organizations that are probably well known to this community. Not only that, the newly minted Cardinal Robert McElroy of San Diego, and newly minted is important because it shows that he has found favor with the Pope, has more recently joined this polarized debate on war and nuclear weapons. He made an address at Notre Dame in March of this year, Our New Moment, Renewing Catholic Teaching on War and Peace, where he argued that the Church has to also redesign its moral framework on war and peace, and basically jettison this concept of any just war doctrine in favor of comprehensive nonviolence. He says that since just war doctrine has failed to prevent wars, there are no just wars. And since nuclear deterrence has failed to engender disarmament, nuclear deterrence has had no effect. And nonviolent resistance must be placed at the center of the Church's theology of war and peace. And again, the very possession of nuclear weapons is morally illicit. So why are such pronouncements so troubling? Especially to a Catholic who has worked all his life in the nuclear weapons enterprise. I mean, first of all, it misrepresents the nature of deterrence and the evolution of U.S. nuclear weapons policy. We do not live in a strategic doctrine framed by mutual assured destruction anymore. The pronouncements are corrupted, obviously corrupted by the political influence of a distinctly anti-nuclear ideology. And that anti-nuclear ideology is not just about the weapons, but also nuclear energy. Both of these sectors of the nuclear enterprise are basically condemned as being too dangerous for humanity. Unfortunately, all of these writings are not substantiated with a deeper reflection on the traditional teaching that the Church has taught through centuries on just war doctrine, and it doesn't provide a contemporary context to how just war doctrine could relate to nuclear weapons in the 21st century. And again, these pronouncements were not informed through dialogue with Catholic professionals who are working in the national security fields. This is in contrast to the statement of the Catholic bishops back in the 1980s. If you remember, those of you, I guess most of you have been were around then, looking around the audience. There was a nuclear freeze movement in the early 1980s, precipitated by the U.S. Maintaining that they wanted to introduce intermediate nuclear forces in the European theater. And so the nuclear freeze movement originated, and the Catholic bishops did an in-depth study of just war doctrine and church teaching in the context of the current situation. And they published a document in 1983, The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response, which is available on many bookshelves and in bookstores. But unlike today, the bishops, before they finished their final draft and issued their final document, they sought input from broad base of contributors. Government officials, people working in the nuclear weapons business, military, as well as the religious orders and the members of the magisterium. And in fact, it precipitated an activity here in Los Alamos. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Maury and I are the only ones in this audience that participated in that. And we wrote a very in-depth, I thought, study and a response to the bishops, which I believe was appreciated. In the end, the document it held true to just war doctrine, even though it had specific applications addressing what a more moral approach to nuclear weapons deployment would be. So let me talk a little bit about deterrence. Deterrence maintains peace by persuading the enemies that any attack may be met with a response that is both credible and undeniably severe. Parents know this really well. In the Webster definition of deterrence, it talks about dissuading bad behavior with a threat of significant punishment, a strategy designed to discourage an enemy from attacking in the first place. Now, nuclear deterrence remains the bedrock of U.S. national security. And in this bottom box here, I quote from the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review that was put out fairly recently. As long as nuclear weapons exist, the fundamental role of U.S. nuclear weapons is deter nuclear attack on the United States, our allies, and partners. The U.S. would only consider the U.S. use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the most vital interests of the U.S. and its allies and partners. So, reflecting back on church teaching, the popes have envisioned, and this goes back to Saint Pope John the 23rd, who wrote Pacem in Terris as an encyclical in 1963 in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So nuclear war was heavy on his mind and conscience. But even he, in this document, didn't condemn nuclear weapons. He understood that in order to abolish them altogether, a process needs to occur that is complete and thorough, and it must proceed from inner conviction, and has everyone sincerely cooperating to banish this culture of fear. The true solid peace of nations consists not in the equality of arms, but in mutual trust alone. So in a way, not in a way, in a very direct way, Pope John the 23rd envisioned a fairly long path towards disarmament, which goes to the very heart of original sin and the consequences of that sin in humanity. And it requires a transformation of the human heart, which doesn't come overnight. This was institutionalized in the documents of Vatican II. In these documents, Gaudium et Spes specifically, the Church teaches that in light of nuclear weapons, we have to start thinking about war with an entirely new attitude. But they continue to enforce the idea that mutual trust between nations is what ultimately has to undergird any kind of world without nuclear weapons. And the true beginnings of disarmament, disarmament cannot take place, definitely not unilaterally, but proceeding at an equal pace according to agreement, which one can't disagree with what they say there. At least this one can. The Pope that had the clearest view of what totalitarianism does, both from the Nazi occupation of Poland as well as the Soviet occupation of Poland, he was very clear in stating a clear and consistent teaching of the Catholic Church. Yes, he deplored the arms race and called for mutual, progressive, and verifiable reduction of arms. And he also stated that this can't be done unless nation states respected the independence, freedom, and legitimate security of each nation. He did issue a conditional moral acceptance of deterrence, stating that deterrence is not an end in itself, but is only a step on the way towards progressive disarmament. He also linked the goal of disarmament to the goal of human development, as did Pope Francis, but in a substantially different way. He looked at the disparity between the rich and poor living together on one planet would ultimately, unless it was addressed and resolved, it would lead to resentment and violence and war, which again is hardly arguable. Now let me go back to deterrence. Many popular conceptions, not only the ones that undergird or are involved in the church teaching, but also in the popular consciousness, assume that the mutual assured destruction strategy that was a strategy that the United States had in the very early years of nuclear weapons. And basically stating that the nuclear force of one side must be able to survive a first strike by its adversary and then return fire and successfully annihilate the adversary's homeland, which included all the population centers and industrial centers. All of these would be destroyed by basically a spasmodic exchange of nuclear arsenals. Crazy, but that was the basis of MAD. Why, interestingly, the theoretical basis for MAD was developed in quite amount of detail by Thomas Schelling and Herman Kahn in the early 1960s. Interestingly, mutual assured destruction can be accomplished by a fairly smaller number of weapons. You don't need that many thousands to do it. Weapons can have low precision and high explosive yields, which is what they had in those days. In fact, mutual assured destruction didn't result, thank God, but was the basis of this bilateral deterrence during the Cold War between the US and USSR, had a tractable calculus. You could actually calculate. The super accountant, Robert McNamara, actually had a formula for when their simulations of a nuclear exchange would indicate that they have destroyed the Soviet Union. And that calculus basically said that 50% of its industry and 30% of its population would have to be annihilated. That would be enough for mutual assured destruction. So clearly, the principles of MAD are morally indefensible. They protect, and the aspects of MAD are that they protect the retaliatory nuclear forces. You so need to make sure that you have a surviving nuclear force that can retaliate on the aggressor, and you don't defend your population. So you're protecting your nuclear weapons more than you're protecting the population of the country. Counter-value targeting was preferred over counter-force targeting, which is completely morally backward if you think about the principles of just war. And damage limitation and ballistic missile defenses were abandoned. Hence, we had the ABM treaty that prohibited both the Soviet Union and us from deploying in a nationwide deployment ballistic missile defenses. So MAD was morally indefensible. But we don't have that anymore. And these days, well, I'll talk about what we do have in a second. The best articulation, or statement about nuclear war that I can find is attributed to Ronald Reagan in his 1983 State of the Union message, which was a nuclear war cannot be won, therefore must never be fought. That the entire strategy should be to make sure that the first strike never ever occurs. So your adversary is always deterred. He will never achieve his objectives in a war as long as a strong, credible deterrent force is there. Now this slide, I think, covers the basic moral principles of deterrence. Number one, let me say this, that the weapons themselves are really, we talk about the morality of nuclear weapons, the morality of cluster munitions, the morality of bioweapons, et cetera, et cetera. Weapons themselves are amoral. They're just hunks of material configured in a potentially destructive manner. Moral consideration has to attend the intention with which they are employed. And the very primary moral intention, which I don't believe that the church magisterium appreciates, the primary moral intention of nuclear deterrent is to never have to use nuclear force by preventing any initiating nuclear attack in the first place. Therefore, since a war cannot be fought, it'll never be won, make sure that the first one never goes off. But there is a secondary moral intention, which attracts a lot of attention, that if you want the primary moral intention to be credible, then you need to have a credible political and public will to actually use that deterrent nuclear force. And what does that involve? Government policy making that is transparent, public budgeting of resources, maintaining a research and development complex as well as a physical production infrastructure for your nuclear infrastructure, and maintaining a credible and protected command and control system. If you do this, you are basically saying you are establishing credibility for your willingness to retaliate if first struck by a nuclear attack. Now, interestingly, without being backed up by a secondary intention, if your adversary perceives that, you really don't have what you say you have, and we don't believe that your deterrent is as credible as you think, it is inviting it to be tested. And it could break down, that could be the breakdown of deterrence. So you really need these two moral intentions working in tandem. The primary, never to initiate a nuclear attack. The second one, to have a credible infrastructure and government policy that says you will retaliate. So, deterrence is dynamic and not static. As I said, mutual assured destruction is not the strategic policy of the United States any longer. Nuclear policy has evolved along with the composition and style of the stockpile. Nuclear policy evolves with the technological sophistication of your delivery vehicles, not just the weapons, and it evolves with the geopolitical security environment. So there's no way that one nuclear policy fits all of these conditions. So US moved from the exclusive consideration of strategic deterrence, and this strategic deterrence in this context means we will protect our homeland. That our vital interests are not to be attacked in our homeland. Right after the Second World War, and especially after the NATO alliance was formed, the U.S. provided the U.S. nuclear umbrella to those countries in Europe that would be at risk of suffering a huge conventional attack by by the Soviet forces that were fairly strong, very strong after the Second World War on the Eastern Front. But in order to provide extended deterrence, one had to diversify the nuclear weapon types and its yields in order to provide the NATO allies with enough confidence that you will really be there to deter something, that happens on their homeland. A German will not easily think that the U.S. will sacrifice its homeland if they are attacked, unless it knows that that nuclear attack, that they will be protected at lower levels of engagement. The counterforce strategies then began to be replaced with counter-values. They began to replace the counter-value strategies in targeting policy. Counterforce means attacking military targets, attacking military leadership. Counter-value means attacking populations and industry, just so I probably didn't define that before. So where the provision of a nuclear umbrella to our allies and our partners in the world necessitated a flexible response counterforce strategy which embodies the intent to end hostilities in a limited theater without escalating to more devastating destruction on a global scale. Bottom line of this is, if somebody lobs a nuclear weapon in Ukraine or lobs a nuclear weapon into Germany, there may be a nuclear response, but it won't be massive. It will be enough to block the objectives of the adversary, and it may not need to go nuclear. It could be totally conventional from what we see today. If NATO was brought into the Ukrainian conflict, NATO may not even have to go nuclear to destroy what's left of the Russian army after the Ukrainians finish with it, including the leadership. So the key thing, though, in a policy like that is to make sure that you can control the escalation from one level to another, ultimately to, it could lead to global annihilation. There are enough weapons to do that. But in order to deter more effectively, you make sure that the deterrence is active in a more limited theater. Now, this goes to dispel the notions that the nuclear weapon states have not been disarming fast enough. This is a graph of the nuclear weapon stockpile. Interestingly, it also traces the different presidential administrations under which the stockpile was held. You see the maximum warheads in the U.S. stockpile was an unbelievable today, 31,255 in the mid-1960s, shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, in part due to the arms control measures that were negotiated in SALT and later by START, and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the stockpile was able to go down by 90%. So today's stockpile of roughly 3,700 warheads is a 90% reduction from what it was in the mid-1960s. I would say that some disarmament has occurred. Not only that, contrary to the church statements that nuclear deterrence was not successful in deterring, in preventing war, this plot shows you the wartime fatalities as a percent of the world population from the 17th century till roughly today. And I mean, if you look at the 17th century, 2.27% of the world population was killed during the years of the 30 Years' War. There were a lot of wars going on between the European powers in those days. Portugal was fighting Spain, Spain was fighting France, you know, and ironically, the 30 Years' War started as a religious problem, as a religious conflict. However, if you look at 1945 and the nuclear era, you see that since 1950, from 1950 to 2000, only 0.4% of the world population was involved in great power, was sacrificed to great power conflict. And since 9/11, since 2000, less than 0.01%. So one could claim that, you know, the data indicates that deterrence did a pretty good job of maintaining a very tenuous peace during the Cold War until today. But today we're in the nascent stages of a third nuclear age. Many thought leaders today are looking at deconstructing the nuclear age into three eras. The first nuclear era, or nuclear age, was 1945 to 1990, the Cold War. And that was the bilateral Cold War standoff between the US and USSR. The second nuclear age was since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, all the way up to around 2020. This age really reflected a denuclearization paradigm as opposed to a nuclearization paradigm. With START 1, the Moscow Treaty, and the New START treaties, as I showed before, there was a significant reduction in the number of nuclear warheads. This was the era when we ended nuclear testing, and we started a nuclear weapons stewardship program that was supposed to accompany the stockpile into oblivion in some unknown time of the future. There was a focus on nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear terrorism, especially after post 9/11. And there was consideration given at high levels and political levels of a world without nuclear weapons. Obama's speech in Prague in 2009 suggested a world without nuclear weapons, but that was preceded by a lot of articulation by the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The four horsemen of the apocalypse were Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, George Shultz, and who am I saying? Bill Perry. Four people who were fairly high level and involved in the deepest levels of thinking about nuclear war and nuclear weapons. They argued that the time was right for a world without nuclear weapons. But I asked the question, that was probably just an interregnum. You know, because right now in the third nuclear age, we have a very different contemporary background. From 2020, one could argue maybe from 2014 or before to the present, we have seen a revanchist Russian Federation which had dreams of reinstating the Russian Empire from the 19th century. Its 2022 war of aggression against Ukraine broke all international rules. We also see ascendant China as a nuclear superpower. A few years ago, our intelligence analysts noted that the Chinese were digging a whole lot of silos to house intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are located mostly in western China and, interestingly, the Xinjiang province of China. If you add that to the fact that they were MIRVing their missiles, to those of you not conversant with nuclear language, MIRV means multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. So on an ICBM, on a bus at the top of the missile, there is a bus that holds not one, but many different warheads. So that's called MIRVing. And the Chinese have been expanding their MIRV capacity, building missiles that would throw multiple warheads, and then put those missiles in the ICBM silos that they were building. If you just do the arithmetic, you find that in the mid-2030s, they will have just as many nuclear weapons as Russia and the United States. Meanwhile, Iran and North Korea are emerging nuclear states with hostile political agendas. Talked about the challenges posed by Russia. Russia's big buildup was fueled by their tremendous revenue stream, resulting from the sale of oil and gas. Not only were they modernizing their weapon stockpile, they were inventing or developing and deploying exotic new nuclear weapon systems, delivery systems. So the Satan II is sort of a successor to what in the Cold War was at the SS-18, which is a very super heavy missile that carried lots of warheads. Well, the Satan II, or as the Russians call it, the Sarmat, has ICBMs with up to 24 warheads. Not only that, these missiles are road mobile. They don't have to be in an ICBM. They could be anywhere in the countryside riding around on a truck. In addition to conventional reentry vehicles that are carried by an ICBM, the Russians have developed hypersonic glide vehicles that are also, they are in that MIRV configuration on ICBMs. They are not self-powered, but they are released when the bus of the ICBM releases its different reentry vehicles. These hyperglide vehicles can actually float in the atmosphere and reach speeds of Mach 20, so that they are maneuverable, so they can maneuver around any missile defenses that we might have. The Avant-Garde system has been already deployed. The Zircon hypersonic missile that I show here in the center is an anti-ship missile, nuclear capable. It has a range of 300 miles, but carries a nuclear warhead and also travels at Mach 8. So that is designed to circumvent the anti-missile systems that protect our naval forces, and especially our carrier battle groups. The screwdriver, shown here in the lower left, is in an intermediate range nuclear missile that was outlawed by the INF Treaty. In fact, the Russians deployed this missile, and that is what precipitated the US to leave the INF Treaty. So the Russians have been busy. Oh yeah, and this Poseidon weapon is also interesting. It's a nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed autonomous torpedo. It basically, unmanned, travels underwater and puts our coastal areas at risk, and it can travel long periods of time because it's nuclear-powered. China has also been busy. Shown here is an array of China's missile technology, which, by the way, they export to Pakistan and possibly North Korea as well. The Chinese missile program targets not only, and I've shown here the radii that these different missiles can reach, the ones that are 1,000 to 4,000 kilometers, hold at risk all U.S. naval bases as well as our allies, Japan and South Korea, at risk. The larger weapon systems, particularly the DF-41, which has a range of 15,000 kilometers, and the DF-5, which is their super heavy throw-weight missile, can reach almost any place in the world, certainly the entire United States. So they're becoming a big player. And they are engaged in the most rapid expansion and diversification of their nuclear stockpile ever. They are developing all three arms of their triad, developing nuclear-capable bombers. They are also developing ballistic missile submarines, and of course ICBMs that are road mobile. So the third nuclear age marks the reemergence of strategic superpower competition on the world stage. Both China and Russia will challenge the post-World War II liberal international order. They're already doing it. Simultaneous deterrence of two nuclear superpowers will be very different than the bilateral deterrence that was evident in the Cold War. Trilateral deterrence escapes analytical tractability. You can't come up with some future projection of can we simulate what will be left after we exchange our arsenals, because there are so many interactions. And it is very similar, to all my cosmological friends, to the three-body problem in cosmology. You cannot predict how it will turn out. Will China and Russia coordinate actions against the United States? Will they coordinate? So do we need to have the combined forces of China and Russia in our stockpile? Also, the possibility of two simultaneous regional wars in different parts of the world, one, let's say, near Taiwan, and one, let's say, in Eastern Europe. How do you deter both of those simultaneously and ensure that there will be no nuclear first use? So, what are the moral considerations for the third nuclear age? I will state humbly that the probability that trilateral deterrence will be stable and successful in the long term is really no longer certain. It was barely certain when we had two nuclear powers, but with three, it's almost impossible to say. So, from a moral perspective, deterrence must be complemented by arms control as an imperative and as a means to prevent an extended arms race. You can only imagine what that would bring with three nuclear powers at each other's throats. So also, the verification, so let's say we want to do some arms control in this environment. The verification challenges will be very formidable going forward. In the old days, verification could be assured by satellite surveillance, looking at and counting big delivery vehicles. We can see where their silos are, we can count them, we can count the bombers on their airfields, etc. If you go beyond New START, which is limiting our weapons now, you will have to go to direct accounting for individual warheads, their components, and their subsystems. So it is much more intrusive, to have an arms control regime in that environment. To do on-site verification will demand unprecedented levels of trust between the three nuclear nations, which is not much in evidence right now. So, Proceeding to a world without nuclear weapons, which everybody thinks would be a good idea, if you really want to do that, it will require monitoring and verification effort more challenging, comprehensive, and systematic than anything attempted at arms control in the history of man. Because we'll be going from bilateral to multilateral negotiations. We'll be going from limited geographical regions to global regions of global extent. We will have to involve all aspects of nuclear weapon life cycles, including the civilian nuclear fuel cycles. Because at that level, if you really want a world without nuclear weapons, you got to know where every gram of plutonium and high-enriched uranium is. So the objects of accountability will need to include weapons-usable materials. And again, what we can find lacking in the church deliberations and pronouncements is sort of a throwaway that, yeah, the mutual and verifiable arms reductions, we'll do that. Well, that can't be presented as an obligatory afterthought. This effort to do it, the negotiations required will take years, if not centuries, to get to. So, almost as a final graph, what are our moral considerations for nuclear deterrence in the third nuclear age? Number one, unilateral disarmament is morally repugnant. Arms control and deterrence must be pursued simultaneously. Arms control without nuclear deterrent is a pacifist pipe dream. Look what happened after World War I in the Washington Naval Treaties of 1922 and the other treaties that were designed to restrict armaments. They didn't prevent World War II from happening. They didn't prevent Hitler from breaking all of the rules and emerging as a threat to the world. So if arms control without nuclear deterrence is a pacifist pipe dream, deterrence without arms control may be a nightmare because it may fail as an arms race ensues. So the moral imperative is to do both. Modernization. A lot of people are griping about these pits that have to be built in Los Alamos. Modernization of the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile will need to continue, and the deterrent must dynamically evolve to maintain its credibility in a rapidly changing global security milieu. And one looks at the U.S. production infrastructure now for weapons. It is frighteningly obsolete. This country cannot manufacture a new nuclear weapon from scratch. Cannot do it. Despite all the money that's been placed at Y-12 and here in Los Alamos, we're finding how hard it is to build that 30 pits or 80 pits, if you like. So the U.S. production infrastructure has to improve for the future. Deterrence must remain credible at all levels of conflict. If you leave it just to a massive, the only way we'll do this is if we kill ourselves, that is morally, hugely morally deficient. But escalation control has to be strengthened, and the command and control of the forces need to be secured. Deterrent nuclear force must trend to more precision and less collateral damage to civilian population. And we need to incorporate both active and passive defenses in a BMD, in a ballistic missile defense framework. So, is the just war doctrine still relevant in the third nuclear age? Yeah, it provides moral guardrails. First of all, just cause. The defense of freedom and the independence of nations has been assured by the UN Charter and makes the foundation for the post-World War II rules-based international order, which Russia just decided to break. Competent authority, command and control must be assured to prevent accidental war or, as I said before, ensure escalation control if deterrence were to fail. Cybersecurity is paramount in maintaining the integrity of our nuclear forces. Humans must never compromise the positive moral control over all their weapon systems. That is a very real possibility. Those of you who watch Terminator, you know, because the day of AI-enhanced autonomous systems may be upon us. They must be used as a last resort. Therefore, we must communicate, build trust, and negotiate, even with the most despicable partners you can find. But that doesn't mean you unilaterally give up. Arms control leading to disarmament is a moral imperative. Arms reductions must involve, if they're going to be effective, verification, and eventually become irreversible if you really want a world without nuclear weapons. Wars need to be fought with the right intention. No more unconditional surrenders in a nuclear weapons world. No total war. Conditional objectives are only morally admitted. Ensure that the nuclear deterrent is credible, which means, and we do not engage in nuclear warfighting. Nuclear warfighting would mean, I don't know where this will go, but I'll lob a nuclear weapon over there anyway. You know, and if deterrence fails, one needs to seek to end hostilities as soon as possible and ensure a just final resolution. Just war doctrine also constrains the use of nuclear weapons if deterrence were to fail. First of all, discrimination. We should trend towards lower yields and more precision. That would reduce collateral damage and focus attention on military systems. We should develop and deploy defensive military systems like a ballistic missile defense system. And we trend away from counter-value targets, moving toward counter-force targets, which is exact opposite of what mutual assured destruction was arguing, or would have as a basis. Proportionality, this will always be tough when you're talking about nuclear weapons. But keep the nuclear threshold as high as possible by strengthening your conventional forces. So if you don't want to use nukes early in a game, in a war, make sure that the conventional weapon systems will do the job. War objectives, as I said, and the scope should be limited. Escalation has to be controlled, and the war must be brought to early termination. Any extended war fighting with nuclear weapons must never be considered. And early termination strategies and procedures would be an interesting new element to just war doctrine in the third nuclear age. And of course, using negotiated arms control to reduce the overall global inventories of nuclear weapons would constitute a prophylactic action, because the less of these there are in the world, if deterrence were to fail, the less the damage would be. Alas, it would still be terrible. So I would argue that the Church's magisterium must read the signs of the times to remain a relevant force for attaining peace in the modern world. Aspirational treaties and aspirational entreaties, just are not good enough to be relevant and effective in today's world. You can't just wish the weapons away. I'm sorry, if the Archbishop thinks we can abolish them, I would argue that if his counterparts in Russia and China can work on their leadership structure, maybe we can start thinking about this as an abolishment. But, you know, that's a big if. The church teaching must avoid being co-opted by political agendas, which they're very much in danger of being that way today. So the magisterium, ultimately, at the pontifical and diocesan level, must be willing to consider the perspectives of laity who are personally involved in the practical realities of national security and nuclear weapons work. And in the documents of Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, it actually says that the Church requires the special help of those who live in the world, are versed in different institutions and specialties, and grasp their innermost significance in the eyes of both believers and unbelievers. And I go back to Pope St. John Paul II. To the extent that the efforts at arms reduction and then of total disarmament are not matched by parallel ethical renewal, they are doomed in advance to failure. We've seen this in world history. And I'll quote this from the Gospel of Luke: more than a little prayer will be required. In the tender compassion of our God, the dawn from on high shall break upon us to shine on those who dwell in darkness and the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace. And, at the risk of self-promotion, I consider this issue that I talked about today in a much broader context, that of global sustainability, and in fact, the redemption of Prometheus, interesting title, is dedicated towards looking at how you create a sustainable nuclear enterprise for the 21st century. What the book tries to do is to weave together a narrative from a civilian nuclear energy perspective as well as a military nuclear perspective, and to look at it in a systems approach to understand what long-lasting sustainability would have to be. So that's late July, August 2023. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for going so long.